Cheers and welcome my friends, I'm Horath and this is my tips and tricks video for ships and ship design in Stellaris. I try to compile all the experiences that I made during my Great Old Ones Let's Play into this video so that you can learn from my mistakes and use some of the strategies that I found most useful. If you enjoy the video, if you found it helpful, then please give it a like, and if you have any questions or comments, then please leave them in the comment section. Thanks. One of the most basic and yet one of the most important things when designing a ship in Stellaris is choosing the sections of your ship. You can see that we're using an interceptor core on this Corvette design, on our Cathilla design. But I could switch that out for another section that would give me other options. We're currently using the interceptor core. We could go for a striker core if I wanted to have a medium weapon on this. And that would change nothing on the available utility slots. Or I could go for a shifter core if I want to make this more into a sort of stealth ship, using these two medium slots to do something. Or I could use these utility slots for putting more power on it and thereby making it more shielded. There's quite some strategy involved in choosing your cores. Each section you can click on it and you can change it. We're using the large weapon slot on this destroyer, but you could also go for different sections depending on the strategy that you are using. And cruiser and battleships do have some sections where they can put cores in that have huge weapon slots, where you can put in fighters or bombers even. So that is something to keep in mind. Remember that all these ships have different sections. The bigger the ship, obviously, the more you can do with the sections. You can see that I can either fit two large things on here with the pulse breaker. That is what we're currently using. I could go for a mass breaker section that would allow me to not only fit a hangar on there or a huge weapon slot, but also one medium and two small ones. And that actually mixes up the variety quite a bit. I could also change that core with the three big ones that I'm currently using, the Singularity core, for putting a hangar on it and having four medium weapons. So there's quite a bit of strategy involved, and depending on what you want, I would try to play around a bit with the different sections, have a look at them, see what you can do. Normally the back of a ship is a bit weaker. You can see that we only can choose the Infinity Bulwark with one large weapon slot, whereas we have two on the forward section and three in the mid section. And I think that is the case for most of these, but it might just be the molluscoid ship designs that have it that way. Maybe other ship designs have it in a different fashion. But yeah, just remember you can change these sectors and they have a bit of a bearing on what your ship can do. Alright, so what kinds of weapons are there in Stellaris and how can you use them for your designs? Well, Stellaris uses a bit of a rock, paper, scissors system with three different types of weapons. There are energy weapons, kinetic weapons and missile weapons. Energy weapons are the lasers over here. These small mass drivers are kinetic weapons. They're basically shooting small pieces of metal accelerated by magnets to accelerate to very high speeds. And the third category are missiles over here, like these nuclear missiles. There's a fourth type of weapons, which is strike crafts. There are quite a few of them. So you can have bombers that basically do more damage to enemy ships, and you have fighters that can act as a bit of a point defense. But each of these weapon types has a specific counter, and something that it's good against. So the energy weapons are good against armor. You can see that they have armor penetration. So the counter to them is naturally the shields down here. The kinetic weapons are very good against shields because they have high DPS. So the natural counter against them is putting more armor on your ships. And the missile weapons, which are good against both, they deliver high damage to both of them and have a high range, can be shot down by point defense guns that you put on your ship. Or by these strike craft if you so desire, and if you have the ships big enough to do that. So all of them have counters and all of them are good against something. Now that we know that different weapons excel in different fields and have different counters, what do we do with that? I would argue that it is a valuable strategy to redesign your ships depending on what your enemy is using. So if you manage to observe your neighbor fighting, let's say, a space amoeba, and you see that they are using kinetic weapons, then I would recommend stacking up on armor to counter their kinetic weapons, and maybe use some missiles yourself if you see that they are heavy on shields or low on point defense. But there is another way that you can do that without having to redesign your fleet all the time, and that is using different designs within one class. And I've gone ahead and made a couple of designs to show you what I mean. So the first one over here is my point defense corvette. It just has 3 point defense guns, and it's basically gonna serve as the shield of the whole fleet. You can put about, I don't know, depending on the size, about 10 of these point defense ships in your fleet, and they're gonna take care of any missiles that are fired at that fleet, because the point defense works for the whole fleet and not only for your one ship. If they are here, they're gonna shoot down some missiles. The next one is the DPS corvette that is just going to try to apply as much damage as possible. You can see that the DPS of the point defense ship is abysmal, and the DPS corvette is quite good at dealing some damage. And then we have the shield stripper corvette that is designed for a very specific role. You see that I've used the striker core over here to have a bigger medium slot and a small slot in there. And the shield stripper is using the shifter core, which gives us more utility slots, and I'm using them to basically double the survivability of that ship by putting on more shields. And we're using that shield stripper corvette to reduce the shield of enemies by using the disruptor weapon. And by mixing these 3 things in our fleet, we're gonna have a much stronger fleet without the need to redesign all the time. And then for the destroyers, just to show you what I mean, we do have a gunboat destroyer that is basically only large devastator torpedoes, or a large and a medium devastator torpedo. And we have the Painbringer that uses energy weapons against fleets that are good with the point defense. So we're using a particle lance to do some armor penetration, and we're using a disruptor to do some shield damage. And in that way, if you mix and match your designs, you can have a pretty strong fleet. Now, what is the difference between the weapon sizes? Is it always better to go with a bigger weapon? Let's have a look at this. I have designed a cruiser that has only laser weapons in here. If you have a look at that large gamma laser, you see that it has a range of 35, an average damage of 1179, and an accuracy of 75%. Now, if we go from the large one to the medium one, you can see that the range drops from 35 to 25. The average damage goes down to 5.86, but the accuracy actually goes up from 75% to 80%. So even though this does less damage, it has a higher chance to hit. And if we go down to the small one, we're going to see that the range goes down even further by another 10 to 15. And the damage goes down to 2.95, but the accuracy goes up to 82%. So there is something to be said for smaller but more accurate weapons, depending on how you want to use them. Because I think the lasers can also shoot down missiles if they have to. And depending on what you're fighting, you might want to go with smaller weapons over bigger weapons. Let's say, for example, that the enemy is using a lot of strike craft. Yes, you can use the point defense, but they don't do as much damage. But if we were to put in a lot of small weapon slots, then you would have a very accurate ship, basically plucking the enemy fighters out of space. So bigger is not always better. It is better in range and the damage that it can deliver per day or per time unit. But the accuracy is actually something to consider. Now, one component that is quite interesting when designing your ships is your ship computer, your combat computer that is on your ship, and that lives in that slot. There are blue ones that basically give you more hit points and more defense, and there are red ones that give you more attack. And I would argue that the defensive one is actually the one that you want to go for smaller ships, because it increases their hull points and their chance to evade, and I think it increases their survivability more than the fire really brings, because they're not packing as much of a punch as the bigger guys anyway. So I would argue that you should put the aggressive ship computers on the bigger ships. Like, for example, over here, now we're making 39.55. If I go to the defensive one, we're making 35. It can make quite a difference what ship computer you use, and the bigger guys are profiting from it more because they pack a heftier punch. So I would go with defensive modules for smaller ships. I mean, if you have a very specialized design, it can still be worth it to take something else. I mean, for this DPS Corvette, I would go with the firing range, because that is the basic role of this thing, but I can see that it doesn't make much of a difference. I mean, difference between 8.8 and 9.7 isn't that huge, while a big battleship that has 70.8 or 70.1, that is quite a bit of DPS that you're losing over there. So I would argue that the bigger ships profit more from the aggressive stance, and the smaller ships profit more from the defensive stance. Why should you build big ships? What is the specific advantage of big ships? And I would say that it is staying power. Yes, you're spending 2,000 minerals on a highly developed battleship, but you're getting 2,400 hull points for it. And that means that it is going to fire with its 70.8 damage until it reaches 0 hull points. And that can take quite a while, because it also has shields, it has damage mitigation, and it is going to fire way longer than one of the small corvettes that only have 300 hull points. So that is something to take into consideration. Bigger ships have longer staying power. So now that you know about the advantage of big ships, their longer staying power, why should you build smaller ships? What is their advantage? Well, first, there is cost. You can pump out a huge amount of these corvettes, and you can actually get more hull points out of it. If you build 10 of these guys, you're going to pay 2,000 as well as for the battleship, and you're going to get 3,000 hull points out of it instead of the 2,400. The destroyers as well, and you can build them much faster too. That is one of the considerations. It's going to take us over a year to build one battleship, while it's only going to take 60 days to build a small corvette. So especially after your fleet got destroyed and you have to get ships fast, then building the smaller ships over the bigger ships is definitely a thing. Well, I would build bigger ships when I got the time and I'm not at war and I can just bring up my navy up to snuff, then I would build bigger ships. And the smaller ships also have an additional advantage. They are wasting enemy damage. What do I mean by that? So let's think about a situation where we have two fleets, and one fleet is focus firing the other fleet, and they're all firing on one corvette. So the corvette takes, let's say, 2,800 damage because they're all firing at the same time. Well, yes, it's gonna get destroyed, but of those 2,800 damage that it receives, only 300 actually matter. 2,500 damage are completely wasted. So fleets that consist mainly of small ships are actually wasting enemy damage, and can make up for some of the staying power of the big ships. Now, I've seen some people argue specifically that corvettes are useless as soon as you have battleships. And I would like to strongly disagree, because there's something that makes corvettes viable even in the end game, and that is evasion. So if you have a look at our ships over here, let's look at our DPS corvette first. You can see that we have an evasion value, and evasion basically lets you avoid any damage that would have been dealt. Now, this has a aggressive combat computer on it, so it doesn't really do anything for evasion. But if you go to our point defense corvette that has a defensive computer on it, it gets +10 to chance to evade. So in 30% of the cases when this ship gets shot at, it will evade the damage completely, and that is huge. That can make or break you if you can evade that damage, and especially if you can stack that. The bigger the ships get, the less evasion they have, because they just are bigger targets. Like a huge lumbering battleship, it can't do much to avoid enemy fire, so they get a -75% penalty to evasion. You can still do something. I mean, evasion basically hinges on your thrusters. The better your thrusters, the higher your evasion. But you can do something with the combat computer. If you were to put a precognitive interface, the best of the damage mitigating things, on there. Although, yeah, you could argue that the defensive combat computer is just as good, especially for big ships, pumping up the hull points. Then you get at least to 10% evasion, but these guys are never gonna evade much. They have other strengths. They have a lot of hull points and a lot of staying power, but you can actually make corvettes quite viable even in the end game by stacking the evasion on them. This ship does avoid 40% of all attacks that go towards it. So it has a chance of 2 in 5 to avoid damage, and that's pretty cool. And you can even increase that more by, where is it? Yeah, over here, by putting a fleet academy on the spaceport that you build it in. That increases the chance to evade by +5, and yeah, that is why corvettes are useful even in the end game. Now, one of the things that you can do to get even more out of your ship designs is actually producing them at a spaceport where you have been stacking modules to increase the stats of your ships. There are quite a few things available that can help your ships be way better than normal. So for example, there's the Fleet Academy that increases the chance to evade for ships. We've seen that in the Corvette argument. +5 to evade is nothing to sneeze at. +5% weapons damage is pretty good. And chance to hit is very good as well. Then we have the Engineering Bay in here. The Orbit modifier, it's useful if you want to park your fleet here, but it is even more useful that it reduces all ship upkeep by 10%. That can make quite a difference, especially if you are building battleships. The maintenance isn't that big on corvettes, but you can see that we will pay 11 credits and 11 minerals for this battleship that we're currently building, while we're only paying 1.01 on this one. Then we have... yeah, that isn't really relevant. That is just for the orbit. But that one, the Pytharian refinery that we built because we have a special resource, increases the chance to evade for ships even more and increases their speed and sublight speed by quite a bit. And there are other modules that it can put on them. For example, we have the Garanthium Forge, we have the Lithuric Gas Refinery, the Angos Refinery, and depending on what you're rolling with, you might actually decide to stack modules in a different way. For example, if you're heavy on energy weapons, don't put a Telda ammunition factory on your spaceport. Put a Angos refinery on them instead, and just stack all the things that you can use for your ships. So for example, the evasion bonus might be particularly tasty for your corvettes, while for your bigger ships you might want to go with the Garanthium Forge to pump up their hull points, which isn't really a thing for smaller ships. But in that way, if you help your ships by putting good modules on the spaceports that you're building them with, you can get way better ships than your neighbors. Now, one last thing that makes battleships pretty cool and nice to have in a battle is that they have the same auras, or most of the same auras that huge battle stations get. If you have already designed battle stations, you know that they have different things that they can put on them, like a subspace snare, which pulls ships out of hyperspace at the spot where the station is placed in. There are other things like minefields. The bigger stations have 2 of these auras, but you can also put these auras on your battleships, and that is actually pretty cool, and you can use that to help your playstyle. So for example, if you're already using things that go around shields, then forget about the shield dampener. Use something else. What I found particularly useful is because I use wormholes, I have a bit of a difficulty catching enemy ships. And that is one of the reasons why I use subspace snares on my ships. So that keeps enemies in my range for longer. It increases the damage that they take from emergency FTL jumps, I think. Or at least it increases the time that they need to get out of there. So that is something that you can pick and mix to your advantage. You can go for hull regeneration, you can go for shield regeneration for your allied ships, you can go for shield reduction for enemy ships and reduce shield regeneration, and you can also reduce the fire rate of enemy ships as well as the subspace snare. So combining them with your strategy can help you hugely, or be just a minor thing that you don't care about. You can also, if you want to save power, then you can also go without one of these. They cost 200 power, so if you have a ship that is particularly power hungry, maybe you want to just create a crazy damage dealer. So all you're gonna do is swap out that thing, and you need 200 power less. Then you can go for some nice reactors and still stack a big amount of shields on it. More shields than you could put on it when you have an aura. But I would always try to have at least some battleships with auras in my fleet. That is definitely pretty useful. Hooray! You made it to the end of the video. If you found any of these tips helpful, then please give the video a like. So that I can show up in search rankings and help even more people. If you want to know more about Stellaris, you might want to check out the playlist. I got some other tutorial and tips videos for Stellaris that might help you. If you have any questions or comments, then please leave them in the comment section. And I do hope that I see you in one of my Let's Play series. Thanks, bye bye.